How are you?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for showing up on this very beautiful day. I know some of you at least, had other things to do. Some of you are happy to be here out of the office. Either way, we're very grateful to have you here. And I think a lot of you probably know that I recently transitioned into a new position, and I'm no longer serving as the project coordinator for the Benton-Tama Nutrient Reduction Demonstration Project. But I wanted to introduce you to the new coordinator, Shelby Williams. She just started this week, so you guys should all shake hands with her and introduce yourself afterwards so that she can jump right in. If you want to talk a minute, you can, otherwise.
No.
Okay. So we're here today to talk about water quality and saturated buffers. And I just wanted to put a plug in for a quick second about cost share. The Benton-Tama Nutrient Reduction Demonstration Project is a state-funded project, which means we can pay up to 50% of the cost, which is what was done on this particular saturated buffer. And then the federal NRCS office has other programs as well for cost share. And I think Iowa State they have a monitoring system they can install, and I'm not sure what all is going on there as far as if that's an additional cost or whatnot, but Kent Heinkins is here and he can talk a little bit about that. Right now I'll pass this off to Al, and he'll tell you all about why he wanted a saturated buffer.
Hi, I'm Al Shafel. Al and Ruth, my wife, we own this farm, and the home farm's right over there where the silos are. I've been no-tilling for 20 years, since 1992, so that's been part of my program. In 2012 we had kind of a rain that caused some erosion on my long-term no-till, and so we started getting into cover crops, and from that I worked with Brant and Ben Fail. They rent most of my ground, and so we have cover crops and all this. As you got a bonus today, you see the cover crops and all of this, and if you look straight north, you'll see a cornfield that had cover crops. That field had oats on it, so it winter killed. You don't see much today because it's already decomposed. And if you go by 12th Avenue on the way home, you'll see a bean field that is no-till with cover crops similar to this. Only you'll see one thing there that you might surprise you. There's been pattern tile in there, so we had leveled tile ditches, and you'll see places where it's more bare and the beans are a little bigger. But this doesn't mean that we're going to get more beans. Actually, the beans that are where the stalks are probably are a little shorter, and they're probably putting on more nodules, and the corn stalks are actually pulling nitrogen out of the ground. But by August, that nitrogen will come back along with the 30 pounds that come off of the cover crops, and so we'll have extra nitrogen to make more beans in the fall. And that's the whole tutorial out of no-tilling soybeans in a nutshell. The cornfield was one of the first times we've done any major putting of corn behind rye. We did a small amount last year, and it seems to be a little more of a challenge. As you look at the field, you'll see it's a greener and then it's a little lighter. It's a different hybrid. That doesn't mean that other corn doesn't have the same nitrogen on. It's just a different hybrid. And on the north side, you'll see a strip in there where we left a little bit go, and we didn't spray it until 2 weeks after planting the corn just to see what would happen. So you get a good chance to look at a lot of things. And then as an added bonus today, as you come in, you saw these prairie strips, and we're going to have Ashley talk about the prairie strips that's over here on Randy and Larry Luz's farm, because I think we need everything. We need no-till, cover crops, waterways, prairie strips, anything we can get to do it. This edge of field buffer that we're going to talk about is something that I know it'll never make me a nickel. I think they ought to get the cost share up to 75% on something like this, but it intercepts the water. The boys from the Soybean Association can tell you how it works. I like them better than the buffer bioreactor, because you got to put all of the water chips in there and replace them. This thing here should keep working. They can explain how, but there has been no water. There's lateral tiles coming across here. There has been no water going over the gates since April. Last fall when it was wet, there was some went over, but it's been treating everything. So the water is soaking out into this ground and being treated 100% at this time. So I guess you're going to tell us how they work, right, Keegan?
Sure, I'll try. Hey, thanks, Al. I agree we should have more cost share for these edge of field practices, and Al's right. It's a whole systems approach where we actually start up in the field with the nutrient management, looking at your tillage and your nitrogen application, and then looking at options like the cover crops and the no-till. But then sometimes we find out that that's not enough, so we need to have these edge of field practices. Sometimes you'll hear them as conservation drainage, or other times just edge of field practices in general. So this is a saturated buffer. This is one of the newer practices that's on the market. Actually, the standard is just starting to be finalized this summer. I think it's actually still open for comment. There's an interim standard developed for saturated buffers right now. But what we do with the saturated buffer is we use control structures like this to push water through laterals that have been installed. So typically you're going to have about 700 to 1,000 feet of laterals running parallel to your stream. And so instead of discharging the water straight underneath of your buffer that you already have in place into the stream, we actually allow that water to redistribute and go through that soil profile. With saturated buffers, we really want to get that water close to within a couple feet of the soil surface, because that's where that organic matter is, and that those highly organic soils is what drives the denitrification, or takes the nitrogen out of the system before it reaches the stream. Saturated buffers have a few more site conditions that need to be met compared to bioreactors as far as site suitability. Typically we're treating 30 to 100 acres with saturated buffer systems, so we're looking at the 6 to maybe 10-inch tile lines for treatment. But ideally with a saturated buffer, we'd have about 30 to 45 foot width of buffer in place. This site's really ideal with the gradient that we have coming down. It's really nice. We have a hillside coming into your stream like this, because that really can allow you to raise that water table up without having a big zone of impact back behind the structure, since we are raising that water up to within a couple feet of the soil surface. So you do have to consider what's behind your control structure like this. But here we have plenty of gradient coming in to help push that water back through towards the stream and not back into the crop field. We also need to pay attention to the soils that are in the filter strip. We need to have soils that are going to hold that water, so we can't have really highly conductive soils. If we have like those sand lenses or gravel pockets in that filter strip, it's challenging to have a saturated buffer, because basically all that water will just go right through that sand lens and escape treatment and go straight to the stream that way. So we don't want to see that. Also, we don't want to have incised stream channels. So stream channels that are greater than 8 feet in depth can be a little bit tricky, because we don't want to develop a seepage face, or we don't want to saturate that stream bank, because that's more prone to erosion that way. So when we think about saturated buffers, they're a really nice practice in that they're not very expensive. They're relatively cheap, about $3,000 to $4,000 I think would give you a saturated buffer typically. These control structures probably are the biggest expense, about $600 to $800, and then it's just a matter of installing the 4-inch laterals, and that's probably less than $1 a foot.
These three cost $3,600.
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's the biggest expense, is the control structures probably for the practice.
That's all three of them. $3,600 treats 90 acres.
Yep, treats. So like I said, that's not bad in terms of other nitrogen reducing practices. One of the other ones that we look at quite a bit are the denitrifying bioreactors. And I was right, the saturated buffer is probably a more self-sustaining system than a bioreactor. But bioreactors are a little bit more of a generalist in terms of where they can fit in the landscape. So a lot of times you might be interested in having a saturated buffer, but you just don't quite have the right site characteristics to actually be able to install one. So that's when a bioreactor would work. A bioreactor, I have some images here on this conservation drainage guide they handed out. I think it's on page 6 for a bioreactor. But basically we intercept that field tile and we push it through an underground bed of wood chips. Typically the trench is about 100 feet long by about 15 feet wide, and we treat the same number of acres with a bioreactor as we do with a saturated buffer typically. They're a little bit more pricey. They're about $8,000 to $10,000 installed generally. We have the cost of the wood chips, so we put about 3 feet of wood chips back in this excavated pit. The pit's excavated down to a depth of where the field tile's at, so typically that's about 4 feet in most cases in Iowa. So we replace that with 3 feet of wood chips and put the soil back over the top of it. Bioreactors have been shown to be cost effective in terms of pounds of nitrogen removed, how much it costs per pound of nitrogen removed, with other practices like denitrifying wetlands and saturated buffers. Although I think these saturated buffers are going to pan out to be probably the most cost effective practice that's available. I guess the need for these edge of field practices, I have this handout that I think we handed out to everybody. If you didn't get one, there's on the front table. But we printed these off quick this morning, so bear with me if we go through it. But on the page, it has the bar graph and the box plot here. There's a little table that discusses the average nitrate concentration from landform region. So at the Iowa Soybean Association, we do a lot of water monitoring. We're actually monitoring about 300 field tiles this season, with a few more sites being county mains coming in and a couple stream sites. But you can see what our average nitrate concentration is, what we're sampling so far this year in 2016. And we have it sectioned out based on the landform region. So we do see a variance in where you are in the state. So here on the Iowan surface, we're just under 16 milligrams per liter for their average nitrate concentration of all the sites that we're monitoring on the Iowan surface. The Des Moines lobe's the highest, and that's to be expected. A little bit more highly organic soil there, a little bit more drainage intensity than what we see on the Iowan surface. And the drift plain, the southern Iowa drift plain, is the lowest concentration. That's once again to be expected. The soil type there, a little bit less organic matter than what we see up here, even on the Iowan surface or on the Des Moines lobe. But we hear the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit. The drinking water standard is 10 milligrams per liter of nitrogen coming out. So we are above that with field tiles generally. Even with a lot of infield practices like cover crops and high nutrient management, we can still see numbers coming back above that 10 milligrams per liter. So that's when we'd want to treat it with an edge of field practice like this. So this is kind of the last effort to catch that nitrogen before it goes back into the stream. But once again, all these benefits coming from the saturated buffer or bioreactors they're downstream benefits. And so it does make sense to try to find ways to help pay for these, because there's not going to be an economic benefit to producers to put one of these in. It's not going to pay for itself through higher yields or improved soil quality. This is all improved water quality. So those are some of the issues that we're trying to work through still. I guess, does anybody have any questions for me right now?
This device that you're working with right now, it just takes care of this acreage right here. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe Al said they have about 90 acres total between these three boxes.
So if he wanted to do something about that, he would have to install another unit. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. Now then, just understand that this creek runs into the Cedar River, and I wonder if there's a similar device that we put right at the mouth of the creek to treat the water before it goes into the Cedar, so that you're treating everything that comes down the creek.
Yeah, so there's different scales for different practices. The CREP wetland program kind of gets at a larger scale, where there we're talking more of drainage districts, 500 to 2,000 acres, I believe, of drainage coming into it. And, once we ramp up to that kind of size, the cost goes up quite significantly, but you get a lot more treatment because there's more nitrogen coming through those systems. One of the scenarios in the nutrient reduction strategy lays out about over 100,000 edge of field practices like the saturated buffer and the bioreactor. So it's a big task to undertake, and I don't think 20 years from now the bioreactors and saturated buffers might not look like what they look today. I think we're going to go through some iterations and some changes to tweak it and try to catch as much area as we can with these. That's one of the important things when we think about siting these practices, is to make sure that we're on active tile lines, since we do have limited funding to help pay for these practices. We don't want to waste our time with maybe those really small drainage areas, like a 10-acre drainage area coming in. We need to be more cost effective in our thinking and try to scale up. Like this one's a great site where we're getting 90 acres with these three structures. So those things that we think about when we think about siting them.
Well, this site was partially picked because this whole field is pattern tiled, so we knew where they come out. So we picked everything that runs this way, even down into the neighbors here, all comes down this way. So we have right that goes this way controlled here.
Yeah, that's great.
So what would be wrong with cropping this strip? Would it just be too wet most of the spring?
Well, there's benefits from the filter strip before we get to the stream too. So, I mean, you probably wouldn't want to on top of a saturated buffer. I mean, it might, the corn rooting depth probably wouldn't be there if we raise that water table that high. But
My understanding is that the grass will be part of the program that pulls the nitrogen, because as the water soaks toward the creek, we need something to pull it up. And I've never farmed this close. I was farming this far from the creek before, and I added a little bit to it. So I don't see any reason to be farming over next to the creek. Never have, because we got a picture here in the spring of this creek, and it's higher than this grass that's growing here, turned out to the banks of water. So why do I want to be farming that close? It's a good idea to leave this strip, but I don't think this strip is going to have any water running over it. You know, it's just what goes through the tile, and it's a small amount then that it's assimilated out. You know.
plus, the perennial root system is important in these saturated buffers too. To have the root system that's continuously down there and keep on pumping out the carbon to spur that denitrification.
Keegan, have you looked at different seed mixes on top of the saturated buffer? Do you see any benefit from going to a more native deep-rooted?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I think Ken will talk about that a little bit more. We're still, we just submitted a grant application to kind of modify a saturated buffer with a deep-rooted poplar system, and the hopes with that was it can eliminate some of the siting concerns, or you can modify a saturated buffer to perhaps, maybe if we don't have that gradient from that field coming in, with a deeper rooted system, we put the carbon down deeper in the ground, we wouldn't have to raise that water table up, so that zone of impact behind wouldn't be a concern, or maybe if it's a little bit sandier soil down there, we could still get some treatment. So we're looking at ways to try to tweak it, and still be able to take advantage of the technology, but hopefully improve the number of acres that potentially could be treated by the practice. Things with bioreactors, we're starting to modify the designs a little bit. Typically we treat about 60 acres with a bioreactor right now. We have a couple sites going in that are treating a couple hundred acres, and it's a pretty simple design modification. One of the concerns with bioreactors is we don't want that trench getting too wide, because then you get some preferential flow paths going through there, so we have a lot of dead pockets where those wood chips aren't even being utilized. But we're actually splitting the wood chip chambers up, and so we're kind of calling it the double barrel system. So with one control structure, we push it off into two different wood chip chambers, so we can pretty much double our treatment area that we're looking at hitting with the bioreactors, and still maintaining only about 25-foot width on each of those chambers.
Bioreactor-wise, has anything been conclusive yet as far as life of those chips and when they need to be removed? I know that was the initial conversation.
Yeah, so
The terms on that yet?
they still say 10 to 15 years. We actually had our first bioreactor was installed in 2008, and I think it's at the end of its run. We're going to recharge it with new wood chips right now, so that lasts about 7 or 8 years. There's a couple factors on that one. It was undersized for the system that it was on, so it would have benefited from being longer and a little bit wider actually from the sites that we had it. And then also the drought that hit in 2011 through 2012 into the beginning of 2013, that really fried the wood chips because it made it aerobic down there. So those wood chips broke down really fast, or faster than expected.
And is there any value in those wood chips as far as basic nitrogen?
I don't think so, since most of the nitrogen is going to actually be removed through denitrification. I mean, there might be some phosphorus absorbed to it maybe, but we're probably thinking it will just land apply and incorporate into the soil. And it's not going to be a huge area anyways with the wood chips. We're talking 150 cubic yards. Yeah, I think Kent's going to talk about that. They're monitoring quite a few. It's a good transition.
My name is Kent Hykins. I'm with the National Lab for Ag and Environment, the USDA lab in Ames. And so we've been working with saturated buffers for over 6 years. I heavily monitor about 15 saturated buffers where we put them in and we monitor all the water going in, we monitor all the water going out, so we know the flows through it. That is a different box than this because we need 4 chambers to do that because of our flow control device and the flow measurements. And then what we do, like if we were going to monitor this site, we'd pick a couple spots down the tile line and we would grid it with a few wells, and then we monitor the water in the tile, and then as it moves maybe 10 or 15 feet, and then another 10 or 15 feet, and then another 10 or 15 feet, and then to the creek. And I've got all that data. It's really, you should be fairly proud of yourself in this area. I'm here in this area every week because within 9 miles of this site, I'm monitoring 3 saturated buffers, which there's a little pocket here of people really involved with conservation efforts between the cover crops and the bioreactors and now saturated buffers in the last few years. So that says a lot about this area. There's areas of Iowa that we're trying to get more efforts into conservation. A little bit history about the saturated buffer. We have been working for 15 years on controlled drainage, where we could go into a field and we would essentially turn the water off and on at the tile with a box like this. We'd just shut the gates off, and then we'd open it when a farming event had to happen, say planting or spraying or harvest, and then all the other times it would be shut off. And that worked real well in flat ground. You know, by the time you get 100 yards out in this field, you're not going to get any benefit from controlled drainage, mainly because of the topography. So that led us into a project in Bear Creek by the Randall, Roland, Iowa area, where that's been 20 years of efforts to get every farmer on Bear Creek to put in a buffer. And I think this year the last field finally got put in. We put in a buffer just last fall. So like I said, it's nothing that happens overnight, but we went into that area and they promoted buffers with starting 20 years ago, so they're quite well established. Trees, a tree line, shrubs, and a large grass area. And so we went into one of those areas knowing that, you know, between all that vegetation, there was a potential to remove a lot of nitrate from water. So we took we modified one of our controlled drainage boxes at that time and put it in, and that was 6 years ago, on the Bear Creek watershed, and we started, like I said, monitoring it very intensively. To this day, I've still got, every week I've been there taking water samples from a grid of 25 wells, plus all the water is monitored every week in the box and the creek. And I've got some of that information. I don't know how well this shows up, but this is Bear Creek and another farm on the Bear Creek area, which is the Moss Farm. So every year is different weather-wise. Every site is kind of unique that we've gone into, and we've tried a lot of things knowing that they might not work. We've put saturated buffers in 15-foot drop-offs where the bank was sloughing off all the time, and then we'd get students to go in there and they'd pin it. They'd put hundreds and hundreds of pins in there, and then they'd have to go back every week and measure to see if there was any slough off of that bank, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't going to put in a saturated buffer and then cause, you know, something unrelated that we weren't thinking about before, whether it be bank erosion or flooding the area so that plants wouldn't grow. But we've not seen any problem with that kind of thing. Like I said, every site's unique. You know, we put a large buffer in the Moss farm, which I have some results for here, and found an old area where they had buried a bunch of rock and junk, which they thought was long gone, but we caused a little bit of a seep there. It's a trickle about as big as your finger that comes through that gravel and rock from because of our saturated buffer. So there's all kinds of little things you need to watch out for, but topography down to the saturated buffer, we like a slope down to it so that we don't affect any of the field. Like I say, in the 6 years and 12, 15 buffers that we've been monitoring intensively, we haven't had any problem with not being able to do anything in your field at the edge of the buffer that you couldn't do before. And we've got a project where we put about 15 of these in Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, and other parts of Iowa that we don't monitor as much, but are monitored by another group, another environmental consulting group. And we've put a lot of those on some flat ground. They don't work as well because they can cause water to back up into the field. But one thing about the saturated buffer, there's nothing that you're going to do that you can't reverse in, you know, a 1 minute action of pulling up the gate. If you'd have some event where you feel like your field's not draining fast enough, because when we put it into the saturated buffer, we raise the water table up in the buffer. We'll run it in at 4 feet. We'll raise the outlets to 18 inches above that, and then we run the saturated buffer 2.5 or 3 feet under the ground. Because we want the plant roots to be able to reach it. And like I said, we haven't had a problem, but except a couple places where the ground was really flat and it was into a drainage ditch that was a dug ditch, and the farmer would just call up, and then we'd just say, open the gate if you think there's a problem, and you know, we wouldn't have a problem then. So I'll get to some results here. Like I said, the years are all different, so the flows are all different. So you can see in some years we're getting 91% of all the water from our saturated buffers going through. 2015 was a really nice year. The rains didn't come in bunches. They were more, at this site, they came more even throughout the year. So, and at this particular saturated buffer in 2015, we removed 91%. But at the Bear Creek site, where there were more larger rain events, we only removed 46%. And sometimes that depends on the drainage area, the size of the tile, the length of the buffer that you can send it to. We've got another site by Dysart, which only has a 300-foot saturated buffer, but only a 6-inch tile. It removes, we treat 100% of that water just because of the small drainage area and the lack of water coming into our saturated buffer. So that was one that Keegan mentioned. You don't want to put it on a site where you're not going to get a lot of water, but we've got it on 10-inch tiles, like at the Nick Meyer farm, and we're treating almost 100% of that, mainly because we've got 1,600 feet of tile for that to soak through. So and no problem in that buffer treating a 10-inch tile's worth of water. Bear Creek, it's always well over 50%. So we know we're removing a lot of water, or moving a lot of water to that buffer. So now this is just some of the same farms, and the one that's interesting is the total pounds of N removed. So like I said, we like to think of this as just one tool in a toolbox of many things. You can't hardly beat cover crops. They're working all the time year round for you, even when they're not growing. They're working for you. The edge of field effect, like the bioreactors and the saturated buffers, can treat water, but you're better off starting in the field and then using the edge effects, as a last resort. And again, it depends on the year. In 2013, one saturated buffer removed 660 pounds of nitrogen that didn't go straight to the creek. Other year, that was a big year. Other years, it's always around 300, and it all depends on the water, and it depends on the concentration in the water, and it depends on the flow of the water. So I don't know for sure. I've actually taken some samples here, but I don't remember, but I would almost guarantee that this site is already low in nitrogen coming to this saturated buffer. So if it's coming in at, say, 7, it's probably going to be less than detectable by the time it gets to the creek. This would probably be a nice site to try to put a couple wells in and monitor the action of the soil removing the nitrate as it moves to the creek. And I'll show you how I come up with those numbers. Okay, so this is a site in Dyke, and Dyke is unique in that it was moving a lot of water, drained a large area, but there's a huge buffer there. It's on Old Highway 20, and there is a large creek that runs and meanders back and forth, so they put the whole thing in a buffer. So there was a nice area for us to go into. We put 1,600 feet of line there for our saturated buffer, so we're treating all the water that comes down that line. And it actually, part of that buffer is actually in kind of an impromptu wetland there before we ever went there, with cattails and stuff growing, and we had a dry time and we went right through it, and it's flourishing now and removing a lot of nitrate because of all the action of the vegetation, and there's lots of trees there. But you can see in the Dyke site, this is an average of 2016 already, everything from January till now. The average in the tile, and that ranged from 10 to 30 parts per million, but the average was about 15 parts per million in the tile. So essentially the field, the water coming from the field. So then 10 feet away, I have a grid of wells and from that tile, and then it drops to about 5, and then 20 feet away it drops to about 2, and then less than 2, and then I always take the stream too, and the stream was about 13 parts per million all the time. So you can kind of see, and this has been going on site after site for the last 6 years that I've been monitoring. It's not that it's happening because of nature, that it wouldn't be because of our saturated buffer, because we also put wells in an area where the saturated buffer is not. So we monitor the water, and that water is always the same. So if you're pulling water out of the wells where the saturated buffer isn't, then you always say it could be 12, 15 parts per million in that area. But where we're doing our saturated buffer and we're maybe pumping water in at 20, it's always reducing as it moves down to the creek. Because we're moving more water, we're not standing water there. Let's see, I'll find a couple more. And if you have any questions, just speak up. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Or, like I said, I've got 6 years worth of saturated buffer, visiting them all. Every other week is what we try to do. And they, you know, saturated buffer is another one of the edge practices that you don't really have to worry about. Once you get it in, you might have to fine tune your water level a little bit with your gates the first year, and then it's sort of a, you've put it in and forget it. It's just going to work for you all the time, which is another reason that it's fairly popular. Here's the site from the Moss Farm. Now the Moss Farm is another one that's using a lot of cover crops. His box had water coming into it in 2016 so far this year at less than 5 parts per million, mainly due to his cover crops. He's you know, he's not a it's growing corn and soybeans year after year. 200 bushel corn, 60 bushel beans with cover crops. But the water off is coming off at 5 parts per million. And so I've gridded that. I've got a lot more wells there because he has a 160 foot buffer there. All brome grass with some, you know, kind of junk trees along the creek. So it's a nice big buffer. We put it right in the middle of that buffer. It's got good topography to it. So it's got a lot going for it as far as a saturated buffer, but water coming in 5 parts per million. The first well set, I don't have the exact number on, but less than 2. Second set, less than that, and the lowest on the stream side, hardly detectable. But yet I take the stream, and the stream running from all around that's feeding that stream is all still, that stream is still running 15 parts per million.
So have you done any comparison, direct comparison of saturated buffer in treatment field or whatever, but where you had cover crops and no cover crops, just you're obviously demonstrating quite a benefit from the cover crops. Have you done anything?
The dike site does not have any cover crops, although this year that'll be interesting because we've got a couple years of data from dike, and now they've gone through that. It's a 500 acre field, and they have now gone in there and contoured it and put a number of prairie strips in there, and cover crops now. But we haven't seen much benefit yet, but I'm sure it's coming. We just don't have a lot of information, but we've got 2 years previous, so that'll be interesting to look at. The other sites we have, like the one I showed you, the information I showed from Bear Creek, that is, there's no cover crops, there's no nothing there. He's conventional tillage, corn and soybeans. He does side dress almost all of his nitrogen, which does help. But the Moss Farm, where I showed, he does a combination of some fall anhydrous, if he can get it done, or anhydrous in the spring. Let's see. I do have some information of all of the, of all analysis of all the expenses of all of the saturated buffers we've put in, and some of them are big and some of them are small, but it's less than $3,000. And when we buy a box, our boxes are always $1,500 because they're 3 times as big as this with 4 chambers inside in order for us to get our flow measurement. But when we're done with our, quote, intensive, seeking results, then that box will function just like any other saturated buffer box. So, and it's interesting, just this spring, I think 2 more companies have started making boxes for either controlled drainage, but saturated buffers specifically. So AgriDrain won't essentially be the only one left. Now there's also a round one, which is much easier to make and install, and because when you have like in this particular case, you only need 2 chambers. You need one for the water to come in. You need the gate to hold up the water level so it runs in your saturated buffer, and then you need the second chamber for it to run over and leave and go to the creek. So it's not a big deal for them to make. So you can do a round one, and you just have a gate in the middle of that where it runs over. It's just at an angle. So things like that are going to be coming down too as these get more and more popular, I think. So I think the biggest one we put in was a 4-chamber, 10-inch. This is probably on Nick Meyer's farm. That box was 7 feet tall because it was a little deeper in the ground. That did reach $5,000, but we also put 1,600 foot of 6-inch tile for that saturated buffer because he had a very large buffer too that couldn't take a lot of water. So, yep.
The figures you gave for reduction using cover crops. If you get that kind of reduction with cover crops, and why would you need one of these? If say Al is doing cover crops,
because they continue to remove.
But if you're getting it down to like 2 with cover crops, the removal is kind of marginal, isn't it?
It is. Like if it's coming in at 5, most time that case I showed, it was coming in at 5 parts per million, and then it was being reduced to almost nothing as it reached the creek. So I guess I'd answer that. I mean, when is water quality not important? If you can do something more.
Yeah, but your goal is 10, isn't it, for drinking water purposes? So
well, our goal, yes, but remember, it's part of a bigger picture, and let's just face it, there's people doing nothing. So this is, I would say, exceptional. When you've got edge of field effects and cover crops on this large an area on corn and soybeans, that's not happening all over Iowa.
Even with cover crops, it's an annual practice. So some years with cover crops, we're going to see the same reduction. Not every field would be able to get down.
And I would argue too, in cover crops, so we've got a group in our lab that's been doing cover crops since the 80s and pretty intensively. The benefits from cover crops are probably not the improvement of water quality is one thing, but the improvement in soil quality is far and above what you're gaining in the water quality. It's nice to get the water quality, but the soil quality that a cover crop can soil quality that this cover crop can improve is, it's hard to measure, but it's there. I mean, we've taken pretty marginal ground, and with years cover crops, it's you can just see the improvements between organic matter and the things you can measure, but then just the feel of it. You know,
what I'm scratching my head over is that I heard earlier that money's being paid to help install this, and that Al got help to get this in, and there's probably more available. But if cover crops are doing, you know, nitrogen removal and doing soil improvement, then why not invest money in helping farmers put in cover crops?
There is money available for cover crops too, but a lot of times it boils down to the effort that the farmer wants to put into it.
It's a year after year cost. It's not
Yes.
a one-time cost and you're done. That's the biggest thing too. You got to keep at it. You got to do it. And it's not every farmer is accepting the fact that he wants to put a cover crop.
No.
A cover crop is looked at as weeds. And what if farmers want to fight the weeds? They don't want to mess with their crop. And so we got to get past the weed concept. And
it's another thing to manage. It's another thing to do. And farmers that are spread pretty thin right now between time and money, they see it as, you know, I can get along without it and save that money and save that time. And
well, in the unique relationship that Al has, we have both landowner and tenant that are both see the value of a cover crop. Not always do we, especially in Iowa, have tenants or landlords that see the value in a cover crop, because they're going to get paid the rent one way or the other, and it's more how does the tenant convince the landlord, and that's what's unique in our situation is that the landlord sees the value of it, and then also the tenant sees the value, because it has to take a special relationship for a cover crop to go in.
Yeah, and with all the people we've worked with, every situation's unique. Every farming operation's a little bit different. Yeah, and you just sort of have to find what you're comfortable with, and but the more we can get kind of the word out of the improvements you can make, we just feel like the saturated buffer is something easy you can do. It's in relative terms, it's not that expensive with how much water it can treat. And especially we've got lots of places where all the water comes off the field above 30 parts per million. And if we can get that down to 5 or 3 parts per million with a saturated buffer, that's where a saturated buffer, you know, that's where it's really making us money. But like I said before, if anything we can do to improve the water quality from the center of the field before it gets to the water body is beneficial. And there is, you know, there's another somewhat benefit to, you know, some of those saturated buffers, it gets dry in the summer. You can't tell that in the buffers we put in. The grass is lush, the trees and shrubs are growing like crazy, and the more of a problem is some of the farmers that complain they're having to mow more often. But some of them are bailing it, so it works out.
I think there was an earlier question about native grasses.
Oh, well, we haven't done a very intensive study. The more and vigorous vegetation you can grow, the seems like the better it works. Like at Bear Creek, that's some of the area where it comes off pretty high sometimes, and we can get almost all the nitrate removed before it gets to the creek. It's hardly detectable in our last set of wells. But there again, I said we have 60 foot of brome grass. It's got a line of shrubs, and then it's got 3 rows of trees. And the trees now have been growing there for, that was probably 15 years. So they're pretty big. It's like a park setting down there, actually. It's and you know, we're feeding that buffer all the time, and we wanted to, that was one of the places where we wanted to really see edge effects, and we ran that saturated buffer right on the edge of his field. And he did have probably 50 foot in a wet spot, and one year, one of the very first years, it was too wet when he wanted to go in there and plant. We opened up our buffer, and 2 days later it was fine. And every year since then, now for 5 years, we haven't had any problem. So we've never opened the gate again. But you have that ability. If you think the saturated buffer is causing a problem, you just turn it right back into your original system. You have your box there, and then you can go back when you want to. But like I said, that's just an extra benefit of it when it's dry. If you're holding back water and you're feeding a line of your buffer instead of having it go straight to the creek and dump in. That's something we don't even think about a lot, but that's just an extra benefit from it. And I'd be happy. I'll be around if somebody has any other questions, and I've got some other literature to look at.
Where can farmers and landowners take the first step in implementing some practice like this?
Well, we've got a lot of information on the internet. Like if you would search for saturated buffer, one of the first names you'll find is Dan Janes. That's who I work for. And he said the whole saturated buffer thing came out of us doing controlled drainage, and then we thought, why don't we just move that water down a buffer and see what happens? And there's a whole PowerPoint presentation on saturated buffers on the internet. It's the first thing that comes up. I know that because I did it this morning to print that sheet that Nick's got. So I printed out a PowerPoint for today. You can contact our office or Dan Janes. I have a card if you want to contact us, or through Shannon or NRCS. We've been working with the NRCS for a few years now on this, and like Keegan said before, it's just this summer that was worthy of being an official practice. So that's still evolving. It's in an interim right now, but there's money available for it. There were lots of federal dollars to get this research started. So that's why we were able to go in and start up 15 of these in Iowa and 15 more in 3 other states. But there was a lot of background we wanted to do. I've been to every single site that's got a saturated buffer now, and pulled 8-foot cores and we did soil texture on all of them that we monitor, and because we wanted to see, we knew the results we were getting. We wanted to see if that was impacted by the soil types, which it is. Like Keegan mentioned too, you don't want a sand lens, because you can run water in a sand lens and you're not really treating it. It's moving through that sand lens fast. You move into an area where there's deep black soil, you treat it. Your water is all treated. It's higher in organic matter. There's more microbes in the darker the soil, and all that works to denitrify and remove the nitrate. So topography matters a lot. Soil matters a lot. Area you're draining, and size of buffer, what's growing on it, all those things are things you should consider. Nick, you want to add anything?
It's been fun working for you.
He's just being nice. Like I said, I'll be around. I'm glad to talk about it. I've sort of been living saturated buffers for the last 5 years for sure. So I'm not allowed to say saturated buffer when I go home at night. That's what my wife tells me. But thanks for the opportunity to bring our information.